So I just started recording this video about the 300 or 600 millimeter lens, and while I'm talking to the camera with it on the tripod, I look up and there's a Cooper's hawk being chased by 3 crows. Since it's on the tripod, I couldn't get the shot. And then I'm talking about the fact I couldn't get the shot, and all 3 of them go back the other way in a cartoon-like fashion, and I did not get the shot because it was on the tripod here. So let's try this again. This is Sigma's 300 to 600 millimeter f4 lens, and this is such a good lens that it is really surprising to me that Sony did not make this lens. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. This lens fits perfectly right above Sony's 200 to 600 millimeter f5.6 to 6.3 lens and below Sony's 600 millimeter f4, which is like $13,000. In fact, at 600 millimeters, you get the same f4 that you would with that $13,000 lens. This lens fits perfectly the need of wildlife, sports, aviation, and other kinds of photographers. And Sony doesn't have any other lens that can do this. But you're saying the 200 600 millimeter at f5.6 to 6.3, how much different could that be? f5.6 is a full stop slower than f4, which means that this lens can capture double the amount of light that Sony's lens can capture at the widest aperture. And with f6.3 at the long end, this lens blows that lens out of the water. It's still not going to be as sharp or as fast as Sony's 600 millimeter f4, but you could buy 2 of these for the cost of that Sony 600 millimeter lens. I think that this is one of the best lenses that has ever been made for the sports, wildlife shooters, but there are 2 big things that this lens does, or rather doesn't do, that might make it a deal breaker for exactly that kind of customer who might have wanted it. So I'm going to pack this up, take it back to the UPS store, sadly, and then I'm going to go to the studio. We're going to talk a bit about why I think that this is a fantastic, groundbreaking, and important lens, and what you might want to do about those 2 shortcomings. All right, honey, I will see you as soon as I have the money in my bank account. Okay, back up in my studio now, so we can dig deeper into the Sigma 300 to 600 millimeter f4 DG OS lens, and why I think it is this close to being a perfect lens. It's audacious, it's innovative, and it's designed for a very specific type of photographer or videographer. A constant f4 aperture across the entire 300 to 600 millimeter focal range, that's not just rare, it's basically unheard of. We're talking about a zoom lens that behaves like a prime lens, and it really feels like Sigma took everything that they learned from their variable aperture super telephoto zoom lenses and their prime art lenses and sort of like mashed them together in a really good way. But let's get into what it's like using this massive lens. This lens is built like a tank at nearly 19 inches long and just under 4 pounds before you add the 6-inch lens hood. This is not a walk-around lens. You don't always need a tripod or a monopod to use it. It is possible for most photographers to handhold it, but it's really not a pleasant experience. Luckily, the Sigma 300 to 600 f4 uses an internal zoom and an internal focus design, which means that the lens doesn't change length as you zoom or focus. Sigma's previous sports lenses do have external zoom, so they change length while you're shooting with them, which really kind of sucks because you're holding the lens and then as you extend it, the center of gravity goes forward, and now it's really hard to use the lens, and then you zoom back and suddenly you pop back up again. Internal zoom and internal focus is always better. So this lens comes in both Panasonic's L mount and the Sony E mount. I tested it with the Sony version and I paired it with the A9 III and the A7R5. But, and this is an important note about any third-party lens, just because Sony shares the specs for their E-mount doesn't mean that third-party lenses will perform as well as a Sony lens. 2 reasons for this. One is because Sony develops the sensors and the lenses in tandem, so both teams know what their products will be capable of doing when they hit the market a couple years after the development starts. The other reason is that while Sony shares the mount standards, third-party companies don't have access to that communication between the processor and the lens that the Sony teams did when they were developing them in the first place. So the most obvious impact of those 2 design issues is that frame rates on this lens cap at 15 frames a second. For wildlife and sport shooters, that might be a deal breaker, especially if you rely on 30 or 60 frames per second or higher for fast action. Now, the limitation isn't too bad for a lot of shooters and is not going to be a deal breaker for video people, obviously. I know a lot of people with the Sony A9 series and the A1 series that don't shoot anywhere above 15 frames per second just because of all the images that 30 frames a second generate. The bigger issue for me personally though is this: the lens can't focus while zooming. As someone who photographs sports and especially aviation, this is a real hurdle. Like in bird photography and aviation photography, the subject, let's say an F-18, moves very quickly from near you to far away. I am constantly zooming, and my instinct is to expect to be able to focus to keep up with it. With a Sigma, it won't. You have to pre-plan shots or crop after the fact. It's not the end of the world, but it is something to be aware of. I did notice in the lacrosse shots that as I was tracking a subject, you could see it nailing on the eye or the head, and then as I was zooming, the focus box went back to being the size of a body, and then when I'd stop zooming, it would track back in again. So you might not lose a lot of shots, but you're not going to gain any shots this way either. Final note on the downsides, and this is not an issue for me, this lens can't use Sony's teleconverters. Honestly, I'd rather crop on a high-res body like the A1 II than lose light with a 1.4 or the 2x teleconverter anyhow. Optically, I think this thing is great. Sigma says they use a series of low dispersion and high refractive elements to keep clarity, sharpness, and color accuracy high throughout the whole zoom range and focus ranges. I saw almost no chromatic aberration with this lens no matter what kind of conditions I was shooting in. They also have a nanoporous coating on the front element to cut down on flare and ghosting, neither of which I saw during my tests. This lens is built to track fast-moving subjects, and it did really a great job for me when shooting wildlife and softball and lacrosse. There's also this massive customizable function ring on the lens, which if you bump it a few times without knowing what it is, you get some unexpected results. But the cool thing is you can program things to this ring. The ring goes right in front of the zoom, so it's really easy to actuate that ring to do different things. Like in focus preset mode, it snaps back to a saved focus point instantly. That's super cool if you're doing something like photographing a baseball game and you want to go back to the pitcher at any point, but you're tracking somebody as they run the bases. Follow that person around the bases, simply twist the dial, and it goes back to the right focal length for the pitcher. I also used it in lacrosse where I set it for the goalie so that when people were running and making a shot, I could instantly focus on the goalie to see if he missed a shot. There's also 4 focus hold buttons around the barrel, which makes it really easy to lock or activate AF or do things that you program to it, no matter which direction you're holding the lens. Also, some things that are on a lot of zoom lenses, you have dedicated focus mode and a focus limiter switch, giving you more control depending on your subject distance and your shooting style. And in one of my why doesn't everyone do this moments, the tripod foot is Arca Swiss compatible right out of the box, which I really appreciate. I really like that Sigma uses a drop-in filter slot at the rear of this lens for the standard 40.5mm filters that go in there. I love this filter style for long lenses, and really, with a long lens with such a large front element, it is the only way to do a filter. I think that the build quality on the Sigma 300-600 f4 DGOS is not just about looks, it's designed for like real world shooting. I would take this lens out in a snowstorm to shoot polar bears. I would take this out in a rainstorm to photograph Nessie the Loch Ness Monster. Like a lot of sports lenses, there are 2 different stabilization modes. There's a standard one for hand holding and one specifically for panning. Sigma says that you get 5.5 stops of image stabilization. I can't verify that, but I can say I was able to hand hold it for softball and lacrosse without a tripod, and I still got super sharp shots. Okay, so let's talk about the results. I love the images off of this lens. I really like the image quality from Sigma's lenses that I used on safaris in Africa and Brazil, but I love these results. The constant f4 aperture is wonderful. Background separation is beautiful. These aren't great shots of animals, but it can show you the really narrow depth of field that you can get shooting at a 300mm or 600mm focal length at f4. Even for sports, the ability to blur what's happening behind the key players is really excellent. It's not just good image quality considering it's a third-party lens, this is some of the best image quality I've ever seen in a super telephoto lens. I did get a chance to shoot some video, not as much I would like, but what I did get was sharp and vibrant. That's a place where tripod all the way. So who is this lens for? It's for the shooter who wants image quality nearly that of a $13,000 lens, the flexibility of a zoom, and the budget that lives somewhere in the middle of those 2 things. Obviously, it's not for everyone. I mean, portrait shooters don't need a lens like this, but I mean, even as a sports or wildlife shooter, it's not for everybody. If you need the highest frame rates possible, or you need to be able to zoom and focus at the same time, this might not be the best choice. But if you want sharp, fast, professional-grade optics with a fixed f4 aperture, well, this lens is kind of a unicorn. I'd say it performs at about 80 to 90% of Sony's 600mm GM at less than half of the price. For me, it's a lens that I would use again in a heartbeat. When airshow season starts again, I'm absolutely renting or buying this lens. Alright, do you have any questions about how the lens handles? Let me know in the comments below what you think about this lens. Do you have the 200-600 or the 400-8? Is this a tempting lens for you? Or maybe you were thinking about the 600 f4 and now you're like, I might do this one instead. I also wrote an article for Imaging Resource on this, and the link to that will be in the description below. For Imaging Resource, I'm David Schloss, and until next time, go out and give it your best shot.